Hey everybody, how you doing? This is the ZimmGeek channel. I'm your host, Randy Zimmerman, and for my third video, especially since I'm recording it over Thanksgiving weekend, I would like to tell you about the top 10 comics that I'm most thankful for when I was growing up. I grew up in a small town just a few minutes north of Flint, Michigan, with 4 channels on the television, no internet, no video games, no mobile phones, so entertainment was very scarce, very hard to come by, and comics were not only my main source of entertainment, but they were my lifeline, keeping me sane being raised in a small town under a very restrictive religion. And these comics especially are the ones that I grew up with that deeply influenced me, raised my passion, ignited my fire, and made me want to become a part of this business and this industry. Each one of these comics, especially to me, really deserves their own specific video. And I just might do that in the future, but for right now, there's so much stuff that I want to cover that I settled on this, not just as a way of boasting about some of my personal favorites, but to also point out just how crazy, how great the comic market was back in the mid to late 70s. And I realize that most of you that are watching this video were probably not even born during the mid to late 70s. But I totally encourage you to track these issues down. Everything I show you here today I consider to be a hidden gem, in that it's just so much fun to read. They are really too good to pass up. And if you're lucky enough to have a retailer that has a huge backstock, or you're at a convention and you catch a dealer there who's selling reading copies, which a lot of these issues you can find for 50 cents, $1, $2, pick them up, spend a few bucks, have some fun. And now that I've verified my account with YouTube, I'm going to be able to do videos that are longer than 15 minutes, though I'm going to try to keep this one as short as possible. I can't promise, though. This stuff makes me a little geeky, and when I get geeky, I like to talk. But hang on, 10 to 1, here we go. My number 10 choice is the Defenders. No, not these Defenders. These guys pale in comparison to the original team of Hulk, Submariner, and Doctor Strange. This was Marvel's greatest non-team, in that at the end of every adventure, one character or the other would swear that they would never get back with the others and told them to never contact them again. But sure enough, they were back in the next adventure. Or most of them anyway. The cool thing about this title was a constantly changing roster of characters, usually new ones coming in and old ones getting mad and leaving, but the quality of the book was very consistent and very escapist. When Sal Buscema comes on, and he comes on very early in, the art quality becomes very stable. Plus, when Steve Gerber comes on the writing, things take a very weird turn, and the book just gets consistently crazy, and crazy in a good way. During this period, Marvel was also doing what they called giant size issues, and that's kind of a thicker comic that came out every third month on their higher selling titles. The Defenders had 3 of those giant size issues plus an annual that came out during that period, and all of those I remember being incredibly enjoyable. Also, the early Defenders were part of Marvel's first real event summer story, and that was the Avengers-Defenders Clash. It was very enjoyable, very classic. It's available in trade if you're lucky enough to find it. There are also Essentials books out on Defenders that I totally recommend reading, especially if you can find them at a good price. Great stuff. And of course, you can't talk about this period without bringing in my number 9 choice, and that is the X-Men. Probably difficult for modern readers to realize that there was a period there that X-Men really didn't sell, and they had stopped the title. But during their reprint era of Marvel, they decided to restart the X-Men, see if it would take off, and it really did. They were selling more reprints than they were when the title was originally out. So Marvel decided to reboot the title with a new team, and that turned into the X-Men that we know of today. I fondly remember picking up the first issue of Giant Size X-Men and just really loving the title, the fact that all of these characters just walked in, added to their mystery. Now, distribution back then for comics was very spotty. So a few months after Giant Size 1 comes out, they decided to pick up the X-Men numbering and restart the team with number 94. 94 was pretty easy to find, but 95, completely impossible. I remember having to special order that comic from Canada in order to get a copy. and in fact, I was on issue 97 by the time 95 had gotten to my door. So 95 was a very key issue because it was the death of Thunderbird, and very rarely back then did comic characters die, especially stay completely dead, and this one did for quite a long time. I was very familiar with Dave Cockrum's artwork from the Legion, which we'll get to in a second, but the artwork on Giant Size X-Men 1 was so good that I literally dissected the comic to the point where it was falling apart. And I remember going to a local convention in order to get a new copy of the book and was so mad because I had to pay $8 for it, and it had become such a collectible comic by that time that the prices were starting to jump. And to add to the book's popularity, we suddenly hit a golden age as far as a title goes when John Byrne and Terry Austin came on, added to Chris Claremont's writing, which was at a high point at the time. And the series during that period really became the phenomenon that we know of today. All of the X-Men stories have been pretty well reprinted. The early essentials are great. The early run is amazing still also, so don't forget about that. And the Cockrum work, the Byrne work especially, most of Claremont's writing, it is absolutely classic. And speaking of absolute classic and Dave Cockrum, that brings me to my number 8 choice, which is, of course, Legion of Superheroes. And all the research that I had done before I was able to buy superheroes, I had never heard of the Legion until I walked into a little Rexall drugstore in Chesaning and saw it sitting in the spinner rack. And because Superboy was on it, I absolutely had to buy it and check it out. My affinity for oddball superheroes was definitely piqued. I became a huge fan, and I started picking up the series ever since. But unfortunately, the series only ran for 4 issues, and come to find out, it was all reprints. Great Kurt Swan reprints, but it was all reprints. Shortly after they stopped that title, they put the Legion back in with Superboy and started running whole new adventures that were illustrated by the great Dave Cockrum. And then eventually Mike Grell came in and took over after that. The futuristic setting, the crazy classic stories, and just the idea of having superheroes in the future really piqued my interest, and to me it makes all of these stories very classic. Also, during this period, DC was taking a number of their titles and turning them into what they called 100-page super spectaculars, which gave you 100 pages, most of which were reprints, for 60 cents. That was a deal that was too good to pass up when I was growing up. It was also a format that I really regretted that they stopped, and DC now has just recently restarted that format for the books that they are selling through Walmart. And speaking of heroes in the future, that calls up my number 7 choice, those great original 2000 ADs. 2000 AD has certainly evolved a lot over the years, but originally when I was reading it, it was a newsprint comic, a couple staples on the spine, mostly black and white, that came out every week over in England. It was very difficult to find here in the States. I had originally learned about it from a Fantastic Films magazine that talked about how great it was. Being a fan of the unusual comics that I am, I absolutely had to track it down and eventually had amassed a large collection of it. The best way to read this comic was always in large chunks, because there were 5 different stories that were always continued weekly. Each story was about 5 pages long. So if you got to read it all in succession, it was an incredible ride. And you may know this publication as the home of Judge Dredd, but this publication has so many other phenomenal stories other than Judge Dredd. It really mystifies me why a lot of these properties haven't broken out here in the States. There have been a couple of attempts over the years to bring these properties here in comic form to the States, mainly by Sal Q Productions and then later by Eagle Comics. But quite frankly, the printing quality on those stories really detract from the original and the original feel. I really hope someday they'll sit down and do archive volumes where they put entire progs together. Progs is their reference for issues, because it would be really worth it to sit there and read it all in a row. So if you're a fan at all of Judge Dredd, I completely recommend that you look up 2000 AD. Diamond now carries it on a regular basis, so your retailer can get a hold of it. But those old issues, those old classic stories, are absolutely incredible and well worth your time to dig up. There are also essential style collections of some of the brands. The Judge Dredd case books, Rogue Trooper and Strontium Dog especially, are available. Plus, Titan Publishing has done a number of just incredible collections over the years that you'll be able to find. Just keep your eyes open. I guarantee you these stories are well worth your time. Also well worth your time is my number 6 entry in my top 10 comics that I'm thankful for, and that is Secret Origins, Wanted, and just the reprint books in general. Once my parents allowed me to pick up superheroes, one of the very first comics I picked up was Secret Origins #1. Since the title reprinted origin stories of their superheroes, it really piqued my interest and added to my interest in comics history. Then the Wanted series reprinted a lot of the classic superhero, supervillain fights. Of course, they were very formulaic, yes, but they're still really great reading. That soon jumped over to Marvel with all of the reprint books that they were doing at the time, the Marvel Tales, the Marvel Triple Action, Marvel's Greatest Comics, and also the X-Men, which, like I said earlier, literally jump-started the team and brought about the current X-Men team. So when you're out looking through those long boxes, don't dismiss a lot of these titles as just being reprint books. A lot of these books have just incredibly great stories, little bits of history that I promise you are well worth your time. My selection at number 5 is a very personal favorite and one that I reread constantly, and that is Goodwin and Simonson's Paul Kirk Manhunter. Running almost as an afterthought in the back of Detective Comics for only a half a dozen or so issues, the Paul Kirk Manhunter had a deep influence on me growing up, in that I learned so much about comics just by reading and rereading the story. The story itself was a severe rebooting of Simon and Kirby's Manhunter property from back in World War II. But there was such an original look to it, such a great feel, and especially with Simonson's art and Goodwin's writing, that, in my opinion, it became a high point of superhero sequential art. Even though this was Walt Simonson's very first art assignment, he went about it in such a hungry and tight way that it was really an instructional on how to tell a story within the 6 or 7 pages that each chapter was allowed. Plus, Goodwin's writing was in top form. To me, this is one of those cases of right talent at the right time with the right property, doing the right things that truly make sequential art step up a notch in quality. And I'm not the only one to think that as well, because it won a lot of awards when it was first out. Also, the last few episodes of that character in Detective Comics was in that 100-page super spectacular format that I was talking about. So you got to juxtapose a Batman story, these classic reprints with detective themes in it, and then a Manhunter chapter in the back. Touchstone quality like this is difficult to maintain in any art form, but especially in comics, it's exceptionally rare. Luckily, when it was time to end Manhunter, they did it with a crossover with Batman in Detective Comics that was truly tragic for Manhunter, but a high point for all the rest of us. Most recently, DC has put together a Golden Anniversary trade where they had Simonson do an epilogue to really cap off the end of the story. And DC must have really overprinted that volume, because I found quite a few of them at the Ollie's discount store that I snatched up and handed out to all my friends as an example of this is what sequential art can really be. And my number 4 choice really drives home the potential of sequential art, because that's War of the Worlds, Killraven. One of my favorite science fiction tropes is the alien invasion. So when Killraven started, War of the Worlds in Amazing Adventures number 18, it really caught my attention. The easiest way to describe Killraven is if Conan the Barbarian met War of the Worlds. This series is one of my favorites because it's a prime example of what sequential art can do. Not only what it can do, but what it can be molded into. What started as a great idea and artwork by Neil Adams and his studio quickly turned into a barbarian after the apocalypse type stories with Herb Trimpe artwork. Then it does a complete 180 in theme and feel when P. Craig Russell comes on as the art and Don McGregor comes on as writer. And though the comic was never really a big seller for Marvel, nor did it really get a lot of attention, it was, at the time, a high point in comics and sequential art. The series itself almost runs for 20 issues, and luckily is given a conclusion in graphic novel format. Though there have been attempts to restart the character over the years, nothing comes close to the original quality of the work that Russell and McGregor gave the property. There's a really good essentials collection on this out. If you get a chance to buy that, that's great. But if not, those single issues are still out there in the retailers' boxes, and they're well worth your time to dig them up. Killraven and the War of the Worlds property in general had such an impact on me that when Caliber came to me and asked me if there was anything I would like to write, War of the Worlds was the very first thing that came to mind, and luckily we did an entire story that ran for 5 issues. And another mainstream property that I would really love to write someday is my number 3 choice, and that is Adam Strange. Best described as DC's attempt at doing Flash Gordon. Adam Strange was an archaeologist that gets hit by a Zeta beam and teleported to the planet Rann, where he becomes the ultimate warrior fighter and primary protector of the planet as he fends off all sorts of alien invasions and creatures using mostly his wits. Most of all, what kept him on Rann was his love of an alien girl, Alana. The constant tugging back and forth of Adam from Earth to Rann because he went back to Earth as soon as the Zeta beam wore off in his body was just one of the biggest writing hooks to me, because it usually always happened after he had defeated some incredibly large menace and was just getting ready to enjoy life on Rann with the woman that he loved. And it wasn't just the tragic concept that attracted me to the property, it was the phenomenal artwork, mostly drawn by Carmine Infantino and inked by the great Murphy Anderson. Originally running in Mystery in Space, I found Adam Strange through reprints in Strange Adventures. He was the first character close to a superhero that I convinced my parents to allow me to buy, because I explained to them that he was just a normal guy trying to get himself out of abnormal situations. Just like Killraven, Adam Strange has had a number of reboots that at best are cringing, and it's always disappointing to me because they always seem to miss the true point of the character. But don't take my word for it. Dig up some of those classic stories and read this for yourself. Sure, the stories themselves were written by mostly Gardner Fox. They are very science fiction formula, but they are pure escapism. And when it comes to an average guy getting his way out of tough situations, nothing beats my number 2 pick, and that's The Spirit, particularly the ones printed by Warren magazines. The Spirit was created by Will Eisner. And if you don't know who Eisner is, then we really have a lot to talk about. The quickest way to explain the Spirit is that he was a police detective who was murdered or almost died during the line of duty, who decided to proclaim himself dead in order to be able to fight crime above and beyond the law. It's a really simple concept, and it's one that's been used a lot of times, but the whole quality in this is in the execution, and that is all Will Eisner. Will created the Spirit as a character to be syndicated instead of just distributed like a regular comic book. This one was syndicated through the newspapers. He would create his own little comic book section that he called the Spirit section that would go out with the Sunday Funnies. He created the property in the early 40s, and it ran until 1953 every week in the local newspapers. Each Spirit story was about 7 pages long, but those 7 pages usually contained such a compact story that it was unbelievable. When he stopped syndication in 1953, the property sat dormant for a little while and then was resurrected again in the 60s in comic book form. But in the 70s, Jim Warren got the rights to reprint the stories and did it in black and white magazines that he had distributed amongst all the other magazines that were currently on the newsstand. Not comics, magazines. Warren magazines at the time were also printing Eerie, Creepy, and Vampirella. So when I stepped into a drugstore in nearby Flushing and saw the Spirit magazine with this guy with a mask hanging in the sewers, it definitely caught my eye. Then when I opened it up and saw that there were 7 or 8 stories, that further intrigued me. I had to buy it and take it home, and I have been hooked on the Spirit ever since. It always struck me as fascinating with the Spirit in that it really didn't need color. A lot of times it was gritty and noirish anyway, so reading it in black and white was really my favorite way to read the stories. And back during this period in the late 70s, there was a huge boom in magazine comics that was just incredible. If your local retailer has a back issue magazine box, especially one that's been sitting there for a while, you might actually want to go through that box and take a good look, because not only is there some awesome stuff there, but there's probably some phenomenal stuff there that you can get really cheap. And if you find a Warren Spirit magazine, definitely grab it and read it, and I hope you enjoy it even half as much as I did. The Spirit and Will Eisner's work in general has become so world-renowned and respected as being prime examples of sequential art that everything that Will has done has been collected in one form or another. In fact, all of the Spirit stories are together in awesome archive volumes that DC put out a few years back. I highly recommend those if you can find them. I'm sure we'll be talking about the Spirit again in a future video, but the big thing that I want to point out to you as you read these stories is to keep in mind the time period that they were made, because not every character is PC, and a lot of those characters are very stereotypical of the day. I would love to get into this in more detail, but I'm really running over, so I'm going to run straight to my number one choice, the comic that I am most thankful for that I had when I was growing up, and that is the Barks Ducks, Donald Duck, Uncle Scrooge. During the time when I wasn't allowed to have superheroes because my parents decided they were too violent, I really took to every comic that I could, and especially to the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge stories and those done by Carl Barks. And again, here is a creator that's at the right point in the right time doing the right thing, doing his best, telling adventure stories that still hold up to this day. But it's those original stories, especially the ones, if you can find them in their original comic book format, that really hold their charm. And again, it's a tribute to Barks' talent as a creator that these stories have been reprinted over and over and over again. And in fact, my real memory, my most nostalgic memory of comics when I was growing up was a Walt Disney's Comics Digest that my parents gave me when I was sick. That had an Uncle Scrooge story in it about a 24-karat moon where Donald, Uncle Scrooge, and Huey, Dewey, and Louie all have a race with a lot of other people trying to get to a moon that was on the other side of the moon that was made out of 24-karat gold. That story had a very nostalgic and important impact on me and my creativity, as in later years I can point to that story as really being the germination of the idea of doing a lot of the anthropomorphic work that I did later on. And it really piqued my interest in the funny animal genre in general, and it's probably one of the primary reasons why my style is so cartoony. So that's just my top 10 of the comics that I'm most thankful that I had when I was growing up. There's so much more. And another thing that I want to point out before I go is that these comics were back in the late 70s, early mid-70s. Look at all of the different formats that were out. Digest books, 100-page super spectacular, 68-page giant-size books, and those great magazines. All of those formats, all of that experimentation, all of that was fun. And where is that now? Where is that in the current market? The only place you see 100-page super spectaculars is if you go to Walmart. The only place you see Comics Digest for sale anymore is at the checkout stand at your local grocer. In order to really be a true art form, comics and sequential art needs to be not just quality and entertaining, but incredibly accessible to as many people as possible in as many ways as possible. And we're going to cover that in future videos, so I hope you stick with me. In the meantime, I know you've got favorites also, so don't be afraid to list those down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe. Please like this video if you enjoyed yourself. If you really enjoyed yourself, tell your friends and spread the word, please. Thank you so much. And until next time, thanks for being here. Take care.